World of Warcraft has been patched, updated, reworked and redesigned so many times over its 20+ year history that the game barely resembles what it once was. Classes look completely different, systems have been overhauled, and countless abilities that once defined so many specs have simply vanished. Some abilities were removed because the design was interesting in theory but a nightmare to keep balanced in practice. Others were fine for a while until players figured out how to exploit them best, and a few existed with very specific circumstances which either made them overpowered or kind of useless. Those are the type of abilities I want to talk about today. 10 abilities which, for one reason or another, Blizzard decided the game was better off without, and they were either removed outright, or they were determined to be impossible to balance for PvE, and were moved to be PvP only. So with that said, let's make a start. But before we go on, I want to talk about a game that you just might have heard of, and make sure you stick around to the end so you don't miss all the rewards that are available. One of the cool lineups in this game is the Alice Adventures in Wonderland collection. It's made up of Alice the Wanderer, Cheshire Cat, Mad Hatter, Knave of Hearts and the Queen of Hearts. Alice is a high damage attacker who disrupts enemy cooldowns whilst boosting her own output. The Cheshire Cat has been reimagined as a darker version of himself. He chains together turns and manipulates speed to boost his attacks. Both are strong and good picks across a whole range of content. The game is of course Raid Shadow Legends, and one thing I like about it is working out the best champion combinations. There's a ton of depth to it, and champions such as Alice are a good example of that. She's the kind of pick where the right setup around her makes all the difference. If you haven't started playing Raid yet, what are you waiting for? You can click the link in the description or scan my QR code to get some huge bonuses only available via my link. You'll instantly unlock the legendary champion Elenaril, and then reach level 15 to claim an epic champion Tagoar. New players can also use one promo code for a free legendary. Those are BIGDAWG for Torvald, GETALICE for Alice the Wanderer, KITTYCUT for Cheshire Cat, or GOFAST for Razzlevarg. You'll have 48 hours after downloading via my link to claim everything, so act fast. Many thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for supporting the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. At number 10, I want to start off with a bit of a crowd favourite, and that is a new talent that was introduced during Warlords of Draenor, Gladiator Stance. The idea behind it was really cool, and this is why people have always loved it so many years later. Instead of dual wielding as Fury to do damage or using a two-hander as arms, instead you have the sword and board on, the one-hander in the shield. It's a unique DPS fantasy that warriors didn't really get to live out otherwise. At launch, Gladiator Stance increased physical damage by a pretty massive 20%, and for the first few weeks of the expansion it was actually performing pretty well, and in Blizzard's opinion, unfortunately, arguably too well. Not too long after launch, the physical damage bonus from this talent was cut down from 20% to 5%, and at that point the dream had kind of already died for Gladiator Stance, and it was left in a pretty average state for the remainder of the expansion. There was also some other perceived issues with it too, such as now DPS warriors are actually rolling on shields which would typically only ever go to tanks, and there was an argument for creating shields specifically for this spec, meaning there would be items that not only one class could use but one spec could use. So at the start of Legion, this talent was removed from the game entirely, and a big reason for that, to be honest, is because we were going to be getting artifact weapons in Legion. So Blizzard had the choice of carry on Gladiator Stance as its own thing and create a fourth artifact weapon for warrior, or just delete the spec entirely. They went with the latter, though to this day it's a version of warrior that people loved and definitely would love to see, even in a cosmetic capacity. Speaking of one talent point that modifies your entire playstyle, number 9 is very similar to that. Again, it was from Warlords of Draenor. Say what you want about the expansion, but it did do some interesting things to classes, and here I'm talking about Claws of Shirvallah. When you picked up this talent point, it would change your cat form into a half-man, half-cat type creature. Each playable race got their own model for this too. Night elves became panthers, trolls, tigers, and so on and so forth. Also on top of this, when you took this talent point, you gained 5% versatility, which just means you do more damage and take a bit less damage too. The most interesting part of this new form is that it allowed you to cast anything whilst effectively still being in cat form. So you didn't just need procs anymore to be able to use instant cast spells. You'd be able to hard cast Cyclone, Dispels, Heals, Roots, whatever you want whilst remaining in cat form. Some people also enjoyed the different form that it gave you cosmetically, and to this day we haven't seen it return either, despite Blizzard massively expanding the amount of appearances druids have for both bear form and cat form. And again, you have to imagine artifact weapons were part of the reason why. And number 8 is Divine Intervention. Now this was added way back at the start of vanilla in 2004, and it's a spell where the paladin sacrifices themselves to make a friendly target invulnerable for a few minutes. Now from a use case standpoint, there's not really that many times when you would want to Divine Intervention someone. However, it is just badass to make the ultimate sacrifice to save an ally. Oftentimes people would use this as part of their wipe recovery, whether Divine Intervention a healer or something, which would remove them from combat after everyone else had died. Boss would respawn, they'd run out and start resurrecting. Now Divine Intervention working this way was removed at the start of Cataclysm, and I think part of the reason why is A, because again it could break certain bosses, and B, because you didn't really need it for wipe recovery anymore. During Cataclysm, Blizzard brought in the new guild system with all the various perks, and back then mass resurrection could be used by anyone of any class. You could have a rogue vanish or a hunter feign and cast mass res at the end of a combat if you were doing wipe recovery. Healers having mass resurrection as a baseline ability wasn't a thing till Legion. However, Divine Intervention did come back briefly during Legion as a renamed talent, but it didn't really fit the original theme of the spell. And number 7 is another form changing ability. I think we're seeing a bit of a trend here with Blizzard introducing an entirely new way to play a class through a single talent point, not being seen as a success long term. However, in this case it wasn't a talent point, it was in fact a glyph, and this was introduced at the start of Mists of Pandaria, and it was called Glyph of Demon Hunting for Warlocks, which would unlock Dark Apotheosis. This gave Warlocks a permanent demon form that replaced some of their offensive abilities with tanking oriented ones. Your Soul Shatter became a taunt called Provocation with a much lower cooldown. Your Twilight Ward, which is just an upgraded Shadow Ward, became Fury Ward, which absorbed all schools of damage. Your Shadow Bolt became Demonic Slash, and you took a bunch less physical and magical damage. This was in essence Warlock tanking. I mean, ever since Metamorphosis had existed since Wrath of the Lich King, it had given you a ton of bonus stats and made you extremely tanky, so this was kind of the next logical step. At the same time, I think this glyph was just intended as a bit for fun, not to be a serious tanking identity. I mean, you couldn't even queue as a tank as a warlock for content such as LFR or heroics, and of course by this point in time going to dungeons or raid yourself was much less of a thing outside guild activity. In fact, I even found comments saying that the taunt from Dark Apotheosis Provocation didn't even work on raid bosses, so really what's the point of this spec? Either way, some people played it with enough gear you could get it to work and be able to hold threat. Then again, it wasn't really a proper tank ever. So Glyph of Demon Hunting and Dark Apotheosis went away at the start of Warlords of Draenor, and then one expansion later in Legion, Demon Hunters kind of took over the whole turning into a demon thing. There was more recently some hope for Warlock tanking though, and that came out of Season of Discovery, where Blizzard fully embraced this spec and allowed players to shift into demon form all the time and be fully functional and honestly very good tanks. So I guess we got there eventually. At number 6, I have an ability that was introduced at the start of Mists of Pandaria for Discipline Priests, and that is Spirit Shell. Here's how Spirit Shell works. You press the button and for a few seconds it would convert all your heals into absorbed shields, and this just scaled way too well with pretty much everything the Discipline Priest already could do. First of all, Discipline Priest shields scaled with the Priest's Mastery, which meant your heals were gaining additional benefit just by being made into shields. On top of that, you could use Inner Focus, which had a way shorter cooldown in MOP to guarantee your next prayer of healing would crit. On top of that, Disc Priest had another talent called Divine Aegis. This will make it so whenever your spells crit, they give the target an additional shield. So you'd use Spirit Shell, Inner Focus, any unused trinkets you had, and then cast Prayer of Healing, which would guarantee crit on all 5 targets, applying a massive Spirit Shell and Divine Aegis at the same time. And Spirit Shell itself lasted for quite a few seconds. You could really just ramp up these massive shields on a ton of your raid. So every other healer in the game had to wait until something went wrong before they could respond, or the boss managed to finally get through Spirit Shell. It created this health buffer which you essentially had to bring for heroic level raiding back then. It did undergo several nerfs though, because it was just proving to be so problematic. The duration was cut and PvP effectiveness was reduced before this talent was removed entirely at the start of Legion. However, Spirit Shell returned in Shadowlands, presumably because the base kit of Priest was fun and somebody out there thought it could be tuned to be balanced. However, it turned out this ability could not be balanced. This spell again went through multiple nerfs. The shield conversion was cut from 100% to 80%, the cooldown was increased to 90 seconds, but none of it was ever enough. Similar to Mop, it was just creating this artificial buffer of health you were expected to bring, and if you didn't have a Disc Priest to prepare shields, some sources of damage were just far too lethal. So Blizzard removed Spirit Shell again at the start of Dragonflight, and since then there's been no signs of it returning. And number 5 is an ability which primarily was problematic in PvP. Mana Burn's one of those spells that feels as though it belongs to a different era of World of Warcraft, which is exactly what it was really. It was a priest ability that destroyed a flat percentage of the target's mana capped at a certain amount. In PvE there were occasional uses for Mana Burns here or there, such as Moam and AQ20, but use cases were really few and far between. Where this was always seen as a problem was PvP. And priests could run strategies in Arena where they would gradually run you out of mana and just win through a war of attrition through spamming Mana Burn, and then having partners that can mana drain too, such as Hunters with Viper Sting or Warlocks with Drain Mana. The problem was that mana-based gameplay was being walked back a bit by Blizzard during this period of time. Blizzard wanted arena fights to be more decided by clever play and cooldown management, not just gradually burning people down. Now what makes the removal of Mana Burn a bit strange is that Blizzard then decided in Legion to bring Mana Burn back on Demon Hunters as a brand new ability called Mana Rift. This was supposedly a more fair and balanced version of Mana Burn. What Mana Rift would do is put a zone on the floor that would explode after 2.5 seconds, draining a ton of mana. And it was intended to be comboed with CC because, I mean, you're not going to be standing still for 2.5 seconds in PvP otherwise, are you? Nevertheless, Blizzard also got rid of Mana Rift at the start of Shadowlands, which probably tells you all you need to know about mana draining effects in PvP. And number 4 is Smoke Bomb. Smoke Bomb was introduced right at the start of Cataclysm as a baseline rogue ability. When used, it created a cloud on the ground that enemy targets would not be able to target into. On paper, this was such a cool ability. Rogues could just create a line of sight at their own will. This ability would undergo so many iterations. During Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard made Smoke Bomb into a raid cooldown by giving it a damage reduction component, though this was later nerfed in Warlords of Draenor. Then later still, Smoke Bomb was made to be a subtlety PvP talent during Legion. The reason it couldn't exist in PvE is because it just had a tendency to break far too many boss and dungeon mechanics. Oftentimes in raids or dungeons, enemies will use targeting mechanics, and very rarely are you supposed to deal with a boss mechanic by just a line of sighting it. So with Smoke Bomb, Blizzard were giving themselves an extra amount of work that they had to do for pretty much all PvE content to ensure that rogues couldn't break it with this one ability. Ultimately, I think for Blizzard, this ability was just too difficult to bounce in PvE, and so therefore was relegated to PvP only. And number 3 is another ability that had to be relegated to PvP after proving to be impossible to balance in PvE, and that is a brand new Death Knight ability that was added at the start of Cataclysm, Dark Simulacrum. This ability placed a debuff on an enemy, and the next time they used an ability that cost mana, the Death Knight would then steal that ability for one cast. The problems with this ability in PvE arrived pretty much immediately after it was first introduced. During early progression on Sinestra in the Bastion of Twilight, Top Guild Paragon discovered a bug where Dark Simulacrum combined with a mystery boss mechanic could hit the boss for over 1 billion damage with a single cast. During one attempt, a Death Knight just nearly killed the boss by accident. Paragon had to wipe and report this bug to Blizzard so they could go and hotfix it. But this very much set the tone with this ability in PvE and the problem that Blizzard had created for themselves. Comparatively in PvP, this ability's always been interesting. A skilled DK can steal an ability such as Polymorph or Cyclone. And at the start of Cataclysm, Blizzard did lean into making Dark Simulacrum more useful across PvP and even PvE. During 4.1 they expanded its usefulness and made it apply to more NPC spells used in dungeons. The problem with Dark Simulacrum was that for every single spell on NPCs that cost mana, Blizzard had to decide should players be able to use this ability themselves or no. Obviously, there are so many boss abilities which would be unbelievably broken if we used against them, so most of the time Dark Simulacrum just straight up wouldn't do anything if it was used, and as much fun as Dark Simulacrum could be if Blizzard had green-lighted an ability to be able to be copied, at the same time they just couldn't let it be too powerful because it would break the game in unintended ways, and so it was moved to be a PvP-only talent during Battle for Azeroth, and honestly I am surprised it took them that long to do. And number 2 is another priest ability that was added right during the start of Legion, and it's probably one of the most unique talent points in the game, and that brand new talent was Surrender to Madness. This activated Priest's new Void form instantly, and granted 200% bonus insanity generation. Additionally, you could cast whilst moving, but if you ever dropped out of Void form during Surrender to Madness, you died instantly. Of course, while you're in Void form, your insanity keeps draining faster and faster, and Void forms always worked in a pretty similar way where the longer you're in it, the faster your insanity drains. So essentially you're taking a risk here of saying I will be able to DPS long enough in Void form before the boss dies. Yet on its release version, Surrender to Madness was just so overtuned. If there was a fight where you could have 100% uptime on insanity, so you're always staying in Void form, you could have this form last well over a minute. And Void form was just not balanced around it being active for that much time. During the Mythic Week of Emerald Nightmare, the fastest race to world first in WoW's history happened. Shadow Priests running Surrender to Madness were absolutely destroying everyone else on the damage meters. In fact, it turned out to be so overpowered that Blizzard had to hotfix it, reducing the insanity bonus from 200% down to 150%, and they would keep nerfing it throughout the duration of Legion. By BFA, Blizzard tried to rebalance it some more, but it just wasn't quite the same. And then in Shadowlands, Surrender to Madness went through its final version with a new condition. Instead of you just staying in Void form as long as you possibly can, after activating Surrender to Madness, you have 30 seconds to kill your target or you will just straight up die yourself. The intent, I suppose, was to make this into a powerful execute talent that could be used at the end of a fight. But realistically, even with regular gameplay, you could be in Void form for about that duration of time anyway, if not a bit less. So really, what was this talent doing other than just saying I die after 30 seconds if my target doesn't? Ultimately, Blizzard wanted to keep this talent around because it's always been so thematic for Shadow Priests and their Void form and insanity, but when it worked way too well, and when Blizzard tried to nerf it, it was just kind of pointless compared to other talents. Ultimately, in Dragonflight, Blizzard removed Surrender to Madness entirely. At number 1 is Symbiosis. The concept was the Druid cast this ability on a friendly target, the Druid would gain one of that class's abilities, varying on the Druid's own specialization, and the target the Druid cast Symbiosis on gains something based upon their role. In theory, sounds like a very cool system. In practice, very complicated, as there were so many different combinations of Symbiosis to understand and really to learn if you were playing this class. A Restoration Druid targeting a Death Knight would gain something entirely different from a Feral Druid targeting a Mage. Some of the things Symbiosis granted were also crazy powerful, such as Druids being able to receive anti-magic shell from DKs, dispersion from Shadow Priests, and so on. And in PvP, this ability was just as problematic, if not even worse. Opponents facing a Druid had to factor in who they'd use Symbiosis on and what spec they were playing as. If there was a Resto Druid and a Mage, the Resto Druid could have Ice Block. If there was a Feral Druid with a Paladin, the Feral Druid could have Bubble, and you had to learn all these extra cooldown combinations because they were incredibly impactful. Blizzard ended up removing Symbiosis at the start of Warlords of Draenor as part of the grand ability pruning that went on at the start of that expansion. Blizzard did lay out their reasoning too, saying too many abilities had accumulated to the point where the game was becoming impossible to understand, and anything that was confusing, redundant, or dependent on specific conditions was on the table for removal. And Symbiosis very much checked all three of those boxes. I don't think Blizzard have ever given themselves a more complicated ability to try and balance. And as much as they'd stuck through it by Mr. Pandaria, by the end of it, they probably just couldn't be bothered with Symbiosis anymore. So, as cool as it was to have, I think you can see why it ended up being removed. All 10 of these abilities, though, share something in common. They were interesting enough ideas to have made it into the live game, which is the hard part. You have to imagine there are dozens of abilities over the years which have been worked on behind the scenes, and then Blizzard try and put them in the game, and it just turns out they're far too broken or confusing. At least with all all 10 of these, we can say that we have tried them, and because of that we can understand why they were removed or at least changed to be PvP only. Thank you once again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring today's video. Use my link or scan the QR code on screen to get tons of rewards while you can. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.